Well, let me then invite our first speaker, Oana Sorescu-ludean, with the Center for Population Studies at Habsburg University. She'll be speaking on the topic old people, she'll be speaking on the topic new people, old practices, Habsburg civil servants in Hermannstadt, 1750 to 800. Oana, take it away.
Thank you. Sharing the screen now. Hopefully that's all right for everyone. So initially, when I conceived the title, I thought about the Habsburg apparatus as new people, but actually, after completing the presentation and reviewing my material, it was better titled "Old People, Old Practices." Okay. So. The main overarching goal of the current presentation is to provide a bottom-up perspective on the Habsburg civil service as it embedded itself in the Transylvanian Saxon context during the second half of the 18th century. I argue that such a perspective can overturn a functionalist, institution-focused gaze, as well as the prevailing counter-reformation narrative. These are the two main frameworks employed by historiography to capture the picture of social and political change in the 18th century Transylvanian Saxon milieu. I focused mainly on the Transylvanian Saxons who entered imperial civil service, following the ways and the extent to which this transformed their horizons of expectations and their daily lives. I also examined the interplay between the municipal and national administration located in the capital and its Habsburg counterpart, and argue that we need to look at the spaces where these overlapped in order to assess the true effects of Habsburg reformism in the province. Finally, I try to refocus the inquiry on the issue of identity and loyalty, advocating for a perspective that embraces not only situated or multiple identities, but also the strong role of personal interests and persistent socio-economic hierarchies in shaping one's allegiances and practices. In 1732, the seat of the government of Transylvania was finally placed in Hermannstadt after an extensive period where it was itinerant and moved around through at least 4 or 5 different localities in the area. Here it would remain until the mid-1790s, when it was again relocated to Klausenburg. At the mid-century mark, when the most comprehensive fiscal conscription of the province was undertaken, Hermannstadt was a city teeming with officials of all kinds, and also more importantly, the seat of power of the Transylvanian Saxon estate. A few words about the estate, perhaps not everyone is that well versed in it, apart from our Hungarian colleagues. Its small council, composed of 12 senators and headed by the provincial mayor, was the de facto executive decision maker for all issues involving the Transylvanian Saxons, when the Saxon University, its state parliament, so to say, was not in conflux. The royal judge of Hermannstadt, who was simultaneously the Saxon count, the highest official of this estate, also had a seat on the provincial government. In 1751, a survey of all buildings, owners and tenants in the city, of which you see a part in the image here, scanned by the archives in Budapest, microfilmed actually, which was likely conducted for military purposes, revealed no fewer than 35 different Kanzlisten working for the government or the treasury, 11 individuals who fulfilled functions pertaining to cameral matters, and 16 persons who served in offices designated as provincial, who I take to be rather part of the Habsburg hierarchy rather than the municipal or local one. Of course, the great majority are not named, but rather because the houses were officially selected for their lodgings, their office names, their office titles are recorded in their place. These lived as tenants in the homes of inhabitants of the capital. Transylvanian Saxon legislation, upheld in theory by the Diploma Leopoldinum, did not allow foreigners, basically non-Lutheran, non-German individuals, to own real estate in the city. So in this sense, the establishment of imperial institutions in the capital meant a boon for those with living quarters to spare and rent out. no fewer than 39 institutions, departments, or collective actors, such as the neighboring cities of Mediaș or Bistrița, were allocated space in this increasingly crowded urban landscape. It is, however, difficult to precisely state how large the Habsburg bureaucratic corpus was. According to Irina Vușco, and precisely as in 18th century Galicia, imprecise definitions of bureaucracy complicated attempts to produce reliable statistics. It is precisely the case for Transylvania as well. Especially if one attempts to tease out individuals of a particular ethnicity, so to say, if not confessional adherence and so on, it's extremely difficult without resorting to parish records, and even then to say who was Catholic, who was Austrian born, I mean to say not in Transylvania, and so on. According to a later conscription of 1785, which approximates the number of Beamten and Honoratiores, which could probably include the category of civil servants as well, counted 196 such individuals. So I would assume, based also on the status personalis that I've looked for the second half of the 18th century, that there would have been at least 100, if not more, bureaucrats. And by bureaucrats, I understand everyone from the practicanten level upwards to the councillors themselves, who are still located in the city. Who then, I ask, was populating this increasingly widespread bureaucratic apparatus in the capital? Was imperial employment especially sought after, and if so, what advantages could be derived from it compared to similar positions in the municipal administration? And I follow two accounts that basically paved the way for this presentation and for problematizing these issues. One is that of Michael Conrad von Heidendorf, who left a whopping 900-page journal from his describing basically everything that, including prices and so on, from the second half of the 18th century, who was employed as a councillist in the government, and especially in the 1750s, worked in the so-called economic directory, which was established to check Saxon finances, which were in a complete state .
I guess Oana froze.
Oana, can you hear us?
Oana? We'll try to get in touch with her.
I could try to call her.
Okay, can I resume?
Yeah,
Okay. Sorry, I don't know if it was just me or
I think it was just you.
it was probably, this really never happens.
Well,
So sorry,
it's okay.
just a second. Good that I started a bit earlier. Okay. So I was talking about Heidendorf and Hermann. Neither of them was a native of Hermannstadt. So one of the consequences of the establishment of the imperial bureaucracy in the capital was that a lot of people who were not natives, but were from the fold of the Saxon nation, came to the capital. Michael Conrad von Heidendorf was especially emblematic from several perspectives. He was born to the family of the mayor in nearby Mediaș in 1730 and followed what could be called the regular cursus honorum of the time, which exhibited the characteristic entanglements between the imperial and local administrative milieus. He started on this educational pathway at the gymnasium in his hometown, then attended the courses of the Reformed College in Vașa-Hei, and finally graduated from the Evangelical Gymnasium in Sibiu in Hermannstadt in 1750. The young Heidendorf was then immediately admitted into the administrative milieu, being sworn in as a trainee, practicant, to the gubernial secretary Stefan Boyer, a position he had managed to secure with the aid of his uncle, the Sibiu senator Bartholomeus von Bausner. Kinship and ties to the local national elite were paramount in obtaining entry-level positions in the administration. While education was likewise paramount for employment even at entry level, it did not have to be remarkable or to have taken place abroad. Rather, education abroad was merely another prestige marker for the sons of the well-to-do families in the Transylvanian Saxon milieu. Both Heidendorf's father and his uncles had pursued the same kind of pathway prior to their establishment in the national administration. Heidendorf's father was mayor at the time of Mediaș. Nevertheless, the young Michael Conrad did not manage to obtain the necessary travel pass from the government and saw himself following a different road. He would go on to live in the capital and work in the gubernial chancellery, and there take private lessons in law, philosophy, and the history of Transylvania. While defending this alternative pathway in passages that sound a lot like the fox and the sour grapes, actually, Heidendorf admitted that pursuing an education abroad was not necessarily as customary as he had previously noted. Johann Theodor von Hermann, who is quoted here, was also unsuccessful in traveling to obtain an education abroad, just as Heidendorf had been some 16 years earlier. Most of his letters until the early 1770s recall various plans of going to the capital, to Vienna. In this case, to attend the course of cameral sciences opened by Sonnenfels, which never materialized despite all attempts. Unlike Heidendorf, Hermann's main issue was the lack of funds to finance such a trip, and many of his letters teem with thinly veiled jealousy towards Bruckenthal's secretary in Vienna, a descendant of the better off von Hutten family in Hermannstadt, who could afford to live in the capital even with a minimal retribution, presumably out of his own pocket. Coming to working and socializing, again a passage from Heidendorf, who recalls the functioning of the economic directory established in the late 1750s, which I mentioned was meant to evaluate the financial situation of the Transylvanian Saxon estate. Leaving aside the difficult functioning of this department, the lack of trust and collegiality, which are apparent here, had certainly left a negative impression on the young clerk. This suggests that such a situation was not necessarily the usual state of affairs, and that generally friendly cooperation would have been the norm in provincial imperial institutions. This is also evidenced in a lot of other ego documents, such as, for instance, last wills and testaments, one left by Michael Wajda in the 1750s, who worked as a kanzlist in the Oleg Chancellery in Vienna, and whose bequest beneficiaries were equally drawn from both the Viennese elite and his friends in Hermannstadt. So he had not broken with either his local circles, but had not remained claustrated with the same allegiances after moving to the capital. Working in the imperial administration opened up opportunities to acquaint oneself with individuals stemming from a much broader palette of ethnic and linguistic backgrounds than serving in the municipal Saxon administration. While this is not to say that Saxon society, and especially its upper levels in Hermannstadt, had before the 1700s been confined to socializing solely amongst themselves, the advent of imperial institutions certainly increased the degree to which one could have direct and collegial reports with foreign persons, so to say, of similar status. Thus, I think we can say that there was no generalized enmity between members of different estates, as the previous passage might have suggested. Rather, as Heidendorf notes, what characterized the working environment of mid-century Hermannstadt was the hazily delineated boundary between public matters of state and private lives. This is visible also, for instance, in the fact that witnesses to marriages contracted by Habsburg civil servants were almost exclusively drawn from the same professional milieu. And just as any other trade, civil servants primarily trusted others who shared their concerns, opportunities, and backgrounds, if not necessarily confessional affiliation as well. The issues of the government, as the passage discussed here shows, were common knowledge to the general public as news from the upper echelons of decision-making spread hastily to the lower levels and also beyond the framework of the imperial administration. I haven't included here, but also invited to these meals were every noteworthy individual who happened to come to the capital. So it was not restricted to those in the civil service. To this spread of information contributed as well the kinship ties which bound civil servants such as Heidendorf to the local Saxon administration. What about careers? Over time, entering the Habsburg civil service became a viable and sought-after alternative for those sons of the upper echelons of Transylvanian Saxon society who could not manage to obtain a position in the local administrations. Thus, managing to obtain paid positions became increasingly difficult. As this passage from Hermann's letters shows, even when one benefited from some form of patronage and came from an appropriate background. So there was, of course, an elite of the elite who had better access to entry-level positions as well. Now, this is not to say that Habsburg civil service worked as an equalizer, but rather that other possible pathways became too narrow to follow for those who were not part of the uppermost levels of the elite, with the increasing accessibility of education at secondary level. Hermann complained in the sense that about the rules that prevented male kin, father-son pairs or two brothers, from serving on the small councils of Saxon cities, hinting that it has also prevented his ascension in the local hierarchy. The main alternative for Habsburg civil service remained the local administration, which was, however, increasingly cramped as well. Some, like Hermann, wished to eventually move back to their home cities and expected to be repaid with some kind of office for their service to the nation in the capital. Old hierarchies continued to matter more, however, at local level than one's presumed service in the Habsburg milieu, regardless of how many sacrifices one had made. Although some Transylvanian Saxons made the switch to the military by purchasing commissions. For instance, a lieutenant's commission was valued at 2,000 Rhenish florin in the late 1760s, according to the same Hermann. The two main pathways remained those in the civil service, either the national or the Habsburg one. Where one saw oneself working in the future also depended on one's personal preferences, of course. Hermann, who had a slight hearing disability, wished ardently to be employed in the archive of the Saxon nation, to deal only with documents and not with people. He did not manage in the end, unfortunately, but remains Bruckenthal's secretary. A good way of looking at the civil servants is to examine the entanglements of this corps of bureaucrats. Here a passage from Heidendorf. Working within the Habsburg milieu entailed various entanglements for the Transylvanian Saxons, both younger and older. And these were very visible in the case of events such as marriage, where local and imperial hierarchies often meshed together to the mutual benefit of both parties. As Heidendorf noted, marrying outside one's nation and into the Hungarian nobility or aristocracy meant potential social and economic advancement. Given the increased interstate cooperation elicited by working together in the Habsburg milieu, one could assume that young Saxons transgressed the boundaries of their own nation for advancement through marriage. This was not actually the case. An examination of the Lutheran marriage records from Hermannstadt between the 1740s and the 1800s reveals some 61 marriages where the grooms were on the Habsburg payroll. In half the cases, their fathers-in-law were members of the local national administration or part of the Lutheran clergy, which was a specific and very resilient subgroup of the elite in the Transylvanian Saxon fold. Only 3 fathers-in-law were also in the same administrative fold as their sons-in-law. So this can also be on account of the differences in generation. So people who would have been fathers-in-law were pretty old already, so to say. Roughly half of these grooms on the payroll of the Habsburgs also stemmed from the local elite families, the majority hailing from families which had occupied seats on the small councils of Saxon cities. So these were not restricted to Hermannstadt. However, Lutheran marriages involving a groom who worked in Habsburg civil service represented a very small minority of the overall number of such events, little over 1.3%. The opposite was the case for the Catholic milieu. Almost 10% of marriages with a Catholic groom or bride involved Habsburg officials, apart from the military. Unfortunately, Catholic marriage records do not preserve the identity of fathers-in-law. But a cursory examination reveals that very few Transylvanian Saxons had appeared to have converted or to have married Roman Catholic women. Thus, the Habsburg civil service remained split confessionally, with the majority of Saxons Lutheran. On entangled office holding, beside the mayor and the Saxon bailiff or royal judge, who are allocated seats on the gubernium, other senators alternately or simultaneously catered to both the urban community and the empire. This would pose an issue for the Habsburg side as well as for the Transylvanian Saxon estate, especially when both needs were met at the same time, as senators who were promoted to membership in the provincial government also kept their seats on the town council. This created, of course, an increased financial administrative burden on the city because they still received their salaries, while their duties needed to be taken over by other councilmen. Although an imperial court decree in 1752 prevented incompatibility in office, in practice, everyone who applied for it obtained a waiver and continued to work in 2 places at once, actually in only 1 place, but drawing 2 salaries. In 1760, as a testament to the service to the nation that Transylvanian Saxons fulfilled in Vienna, those who worked there obtained a salary that was higher than most positions in the national administration. Other delegations that represented the nation's interests consumed some 15,000 florin in 1759 and 1760, a huge sum. And another example of what service to the nation costed was Samuel from Bruckenthal's expense. So he received over 17,000 florin for his service in Vienna, of which only 13,000 were appropriately accounted for. So, and the records note that it was impossible to ask him to require an expense account, a balance of his expenditures. So it was very lucrative to work on behalf of the nation in Vienna. Finally, to very briefly conclude, Habsburg civil service meant a diversification of pathways of elite perpetuation. So it was basically another way of growing into the elite, into the Transylvanian Saxon elite. It did not mean alienation from this social political category, except in very, very few exceptional cases. The bureaucracy was both a vehicle and a subject of change. Its establishment obviously affected the lives of those who strove to serve the state. Individual agency, however, remained a forceful factor in influencing broader developments in the civil service as well. Those Saxon civil servants who converted to Catholicism were polarized the social fabric of the city, but they were, of course, a minority. Moreover, the narrative of stark opposition between the imperial and municipal administrations was not entirely tenable at day-to-day level. One confounding factor that further models this narrative is the pervasive entanglement of kinship ties on both sides of the field. And one could, of course, transition from working for the empire to working for the municipality without eliciting any kind of negative reactions. And many individuals saw themselves presented with new choices, not only career-wise. Governmental ordinances could go ignored, and the interests of one's estate would often prevail, while one's advantages as a member of the good nation increased. At the same time, the duty to the state often came to the fore when it was itself regarded as advantageous, not only individual, but also to one's estate. Thank you. This is it.